On a cold, stormy night in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a faint cry rose through the rain. Elliot Ward, a solitary man living deep in the woods, followed the sound and found a bobcat trapped in a rusted steel snare. He didn't know that saving that creature would one day save him. Years later, when disaster struck and death came close, that same wild heart returned from the forest this time, to repay a debt no one believed an animal could remember. Rain braided the night into silver threads, and the Blue Ridge pines bowed under the wind. Elliot Ward stepped from his cabin porch with a flashlight and a steadying breath. Far off, a thin cry rose above the storm, small, ragged, full of stubborn life. The sound hooked him like a memory he couldn't quite place. He followed the cry through slick needles and cold mud, the beams shivering across trunks. The forest smelled of iron and wet bark. Another cry closer now, snagged on the wind like torn cloth. Elliot slowed, speaking low to the dark, the way he once did on fire lines. Calm voice, open hands, no sudden moves. The light found a bobcat caught in a steel trap, one foreleg twisted at a cruel angle. Tawny fur was soaked and darkened with rain. Rosette spots shivered against the metal teeth. The cat's throat worked in a low growl that sounded more like pain than threat, a warning aimed as much at the weather as at him. Elliot crouched to the mud and kept the beam off its eyes. "Easy," he said, voice barely louder than the drizzle. The cat held his gaze golden, dilated, fighting to stay upright. Something in that look, fear and defiance, layered together, pinned him more tightly than the trap pinned the paw. He set the flashlight to the side and slid off his jacket, folding it into a barrier between metal and skin. The cat hissed, trembled, then had to catch its breath. Rain clicked on the jaws of the trap like a metronome. Elliot matched his breath to it. In, hold, out. The forest waited with him. The release hinge was slick, stubborn with rust. He braced the trap against a sapling, fingers numbing, forearms burning. The bobcat tried to pull back, then stilled as his jacket took the bite. "Almost," he murmured. He remembered bad winter rescues, how patience helped more than muscle ever could. Wind raked the trees. The cat's ears flattened. A small, broken sound leaked out, half growl, half plea. Elliot shifted his weight and pressed harder. The hinge gave an inch. He felt the machine's memory of closing, and he told it, gently but firmly, to forget. The jaws eased a breath. The paw slid free. For a beat, neither of them moved. Rain softened. The bobcat tested the leg, trembling, and nearly fell. Elliot inched closer, lifted the jacket like a sling. The cat's breath misted his wrist, hot, wild, living. He could smell wet fur and sap and a thread of copper. He wrapped the jacket around the chest and forelegs, careful of claws, careful of pride. The cat let out one hoarse protest, then surrendered its weight, not trust, but a truce born of exhaustion. Elliot rose with a grunt, the forest tilting, his knees old, but his intent steady as bedrock. The path home blurred into a narrow ribbon of light. Pine boughs slapped rain from their needles. The cat's heartbeat thudded against his forearm, quick and staccato. He kept talking, not words that mattered, just warmth shaped into sound. Far behind, thunder rolled like a curtain being drawn. Inside the cabin, he laid the bundle on a wool blanket near the stove and killed the flashlight. The room took on a gentle amber, storm-muffled and close. The cat watched him through half-lidded eyes. The wild still there, unbroken. Elliot's hands shook, but his voice stayed even. "You're safe for now." He checked the wound, found no shattered bone obvious, only deep bruising and torn flesh. The phone sat on the table, waiting for a call to the only vet who'd understand. The cat's eyes slid shut, not fully trusting. Never that, but no longer fighting the heat. Outside, the rain kept time for a promise. Morning thinned the storm to a slow silver drizzle. The bobcat lay on the wool blanket, eyes half closed, breath shallow but steadier than night. Stove steam drifted like cabin fog. Elliot moved with deliberate quiet, keeping air gentle so the wild in it wouldn't bolt. Drips from the eaves ticked like a slow clock. Counting breaths, he refused to rush. He set a bowl of water just within reach, then backed away until the cat's whiskers stopped quivering. The foreleg was swollen, livid around the crescent dents the trap left. When the wood popped in the stove, the cat flinched, then fixed him with that patient gold stare. He waited out another sap pop, murmuring nonsense comfort until the cabin settled. Elliot called Mara Quinn, the only vet who never asked if a life was worth the trouble. She took the ridge road in a mud-spattered SUV, brought a field kit, towels warmed on the dash, and a voice that carried calm like a lantern. Echo watched the door from the blanket, coiled. Headlights ghosted through the trees before dawn, a pale river sliding between trunks. Mara knelt, shoulders loose, hands visible. "We'll keep him wild," she said without looking up. No fast moves, no reaching for the face. She leaned close enough to gauge punctures and bruising, the way pain pushed breath into the belly. She nodded once. Hard case, survivable. Her stethoscope hovered, but never pressed. Even her silence felt like permission. They built a low pen from gear cases and chairs so the room wouldn't close in. Elliot tore an old shirt into strips. Mara flushed the wounds with warmed saline until pink turned clean. The cat tensed at the first touch, not from fear but insult, proud body hating the need. Wind needled the walls. They worked in unison, two field hands steadying chaos. When a creature lets you near it, that's not trust, Mara murmured. It's a wager. The bobcat held, jaws tight, whiskers forward. Elliot felt heat of life through the jacket he'd wrapped around it. A furnace under fur. The room smelled of pine pitch, iodine, ironed rain. Elliot matched its cadence, like a fireman sinking to a trapped heartbeat. They needed a name to speak into the air, something the animal could learn without learning them. Elliot said Echo, because the first cry had sounded like the forest calling itself back from the dark. Mara allowed a small smile. The cat flicked an ear, a brief, precise answer. A name could be a bridge. Echo was only sound, a path that vanished kindly. Pain made Echo drift under, then surge awake at shadows. Food meant nothing. Water finally won. Elliot set his jacket beside the blanket, the same one that shielded the paw from iron. Echo pressed its cheek to the battered cloth, and, for the first time, shut both vigilant eyes. That small surrender shifted the room. Relief pooled in the quiet like warm water. By afternoon, fever licked at the edge of the wound. Mara started antibiotics, kept doses light, hands lighter. Echo tolerated a few bites of venison, then turned away, steady gaze returning to Elliot, as if measuring whether the two-legged shape would remain when night came. She marked a chart by the lamp. The ink lines steadied as Echo's breathing deepened. The weather cleared to a fine, rinsed blue. Elliot cracked the window, and the forest's breath moved through the cabin. Damp needles, distant creak, a hawk's single note circling the roofline. Echo tested the bandaged leg, settled again, tail tip ticking like a slow clock. The truck ticked as metal cooled. The world outside took its distance again. Late light found the rosettes in Echo's coat and set them glowing copper. Elliot cleaned the tools, slow and neat, like putting away a story he meant to finish. The Bobcat lifted its head and met him where fear and dignity balance, and this time it didn't look away first. He let the sink run low so the hush stayed kind. Pupils narrowed to thoughtful slits. When night returned, the stove sighed and the ridge went quiet. Echo shifted, gathered itself, and eased closer to the jacket. The heartbeat in the room evened out his and its two drummers, catching one tempo. Outside, stars pried open the clouds. Inside, the wild decided to stay. The ridge held its breath with them. The clock over the door chimed. Dawn sifted through the pines in narrow bars, and Echo lay awake inside that gold. The bandage a pale ring around the foreleg. The cabin held its warm hush. Elliot opened the window a hand's width so the creek could breathe through the room. Echo watched dust drift, eyes slow, a hunter studying weather more than wolves. Mara's notes sat by the lamp. She checked the wound, let the pad linger only as long as pride allowed. Echo tolerated the touch, then turned to the jacket again, cheek rubbing a groove into battered canvas. When the stove pinged, an ear flicked an inventory of sounds, then settled. No threat, only heat. Elliot dragged a pine bough across the floor, letting resin scent the air. Echo's whiskers trembled, tasting pitch, history, the wild outside made visible. The cat sat up, braced on three legs, a careful statue. Its tail wrote slow letters across the blanket, letting the room read them. Not yours, not gone. They built small exercises into the day. Mara stacked rolled towels like low stones. Echo stepped, paused, stepped again. Pain flashed and faded, tempered by purpose. The cat's breath shortened when the joint complained, then lengthened when the weight found a safe path. Elliot timed the work to the creek's pulse. At noon, a slant of light touched Echo's coat and set the rosettes burning copper. The cat closed its eyes into that warmth, chin lifted as if remembering sun on rock. Elliot felt the cabin grow larger around that stillness. Healing didn't make noise, he thought. It made room. He kept his hands quiet. A hawk shadow crossed the window, and Echo came fully awake, pupils rounding. ears triangulating the sky. The body remembered angles the bandage denied. For 3 beats, the cabin thinned, mountains rushing up behind the glass. Then the shadow drifted off, and Echo let the world return to size again. They tried food. Venison shaved thin, warmed broth, nothing that asked teeth to work hard. Echo licked, tasted, refused, then returned of its own choosing. The second approach wasn't hunger. It was consent. Elliot pretended to fuss with the stove, and in that pretense the bowl emptied, dignity intact. By late afternoon, fever ebbed, replaced by a drowsy attentiveness. Elliot opened the door and set a chair on the porch. The threshold stayed wide and harmless. Echo rose, limped 3 steps, stopped at the edge where cabin air braided with forest breath. The cat stood there long enough to name the seam. Outside, the ridge rolled under a pale sky. A wren scolded. Echo tasted the breeze, lifted the injured paw briefly, as if showing it to the trees, then set it down. One more step, and the world would choose for him. The cat turned back, rested. Healing was also the art of not yet. Evening dropped like velvet over the timberline. Mara packed her kit and left with a nod that said tomorrow. Elliot read maps by the lamp, tracing old trails with a finger. Echo watched his hands move, head tilting at the slow river of intention. A life knows a life by its rhythms. When the clock clicked to 9, Echo rose and limped a circle that widened to the door. The night smelled of wet rock and leaf mould, and something remembered. The cat paused at the sill, looked once at the jacket, once at Elliot, and sat, not asking, not staying, holding the choice like a flame. Rain began again, soft as breath. Echo curled by the open door, nose to the seam where wood met wind, and slept. Elliot eased the jacket closer, but did not tuck. In the hush, 2 heartbeats found one center. Beyond the porch, the creek kept its story low, promising a wider chorus when morning came. Autumn returned like an old song, quieter than he remembered. Years had turned the cabin boards silver. Moss climbed the steps in soft boots. Elliot moved slower, heart hitching now and then. But the forest still met him at the door. Somewhere in the timber, a cat's print remained in his memory, warm as a hand. The ridge kept its routines. Hawk at noon, creek talking low, fog sewing the pines together at dusk. He mended fence, sharpened tools, let days unspool without hurry. Yet some evenings the air felt crowded, as if the trees leaned in to listen. He would look up and feel watched, and not in a fearful way. Tracks appeared after rain-oval pads, paired with the ghost of a heel where the ground sank soft. He studied them from the porch, said nothing aloud. A bobcat's gait is a sentence without punctuation, unhurried, precise, leaving room for whatever comes next. He swept the prints smooth and waited. The new ranger, Reed Callahan, arrived like fresh-cut rope, useful, a little rough. He walked the lines fast, talked faster, and called Elliot Sir with a grin that meant friend and a dare. Reed believed in data, drones, and maps drawn by satellites. The ridge believed in other instruments. They patrolled together after a windstorm, clearing limbs from the lower trail. Elliot found a snag, twist broken at shoulder height, claw marks combed down the weathered bark. Reed said bare. Elliot said, not that high. He didn't push it. The forest had its way of keeping disagreements polite. At dusk, a shape held to the edge of vision, low, fluid, measuring the world by whisker length. Reed swung his light, and the shape thinned into shadow. Coyotes, he decided, moving on. Elliot stood where the dark had been, and felt the air closing over a wake, like water settling after a boat. Nights grew colder. He left the porch light off, and the door cracked, just the width of a palm. The creek's breath brushed the floorboards. Somewhere beyond the yard, a cat made the small cough that isn't a cough at all, an announcement no louder than self-respect. Elliot answered with silence, which is its own language. On the first snow, tracks crossed the clearing at a diagonal, never pausing, never curious. The injured paw's old history left the faintest favour in the line, a whisper of weight. He felt pride rise, surprising and clean. Not that the wild might return to him, but that it had endured without him. Reed knocked with a thermos and a drone, eager to show heat signatures sketched across the ravine. The scream bloomed with animal embers, deer, a fox, something heavier moving alone. Cougar, Reed said, eyes bright. Elliot watched the heavier shape flow like poured metal and knew better. He let the image fade like weather. Wind scissored the pines one blue evening, and the generator hiccuped off. In the hush after, Elliot heard pads on wood, 3 soft notes across the porch, then stillness. He did not move to the door. The wild doesn't ask for witnesses. It offers presence the way stars offer distance freely. Then gone, he found a single whisker by the threshold at dawn, pale as an ice filament, curved like a question. He set it on the windowsill beside his compass and never mentioned it to anyone. Reed would have bagged it. Mara would have smiled, like someone who knows what proof is worth and isn't. That night, the fog braided itself through the holler, and the cabin seemed to float. Elliot sat by the open door, jacket folded on his knees. In the blur beyond the steps, 2 gold coins lifted and narrowed, then blinked the slow blink of ownership without possession. The coins slipped away. The creek kept time for both of them. Dawn cracked thin and grey over the ridge, the kind of light that hides more than it shows. Elliot and Reed loaded tools into the truck bed, shovels, rope, thermos, the radio that always lost signal halfway up the slope. The county had called for a damage survey after the storm. The forest waited, quiet but unsettled. The road wound through fallen limbs and slick clay. Mist threaded the gullies, thick as unspoken memory. Reed talked about schedules and grant money, but Elliot's mind stayed on the shape he'd glimpsed in last night's fog. He told himself it was only wishful seeing. The wild returns when it wants, not when it's called. They parked near the washed-out trail and began the climb, boots sinking to the ankles in soft ground. The air smelled of uprooted roots and stone. From somewhere down the valley came the slow crumble of shifting earth. Reed scanned the ridgeline, young eyes hungry for logic. Elliot felt the hum of the mountain's restlessness in his ribs. At a bend above the creek, they found a gash in the hillside, a whole ledge peeled away. Broken trees hung like ribs over the void. Reed edged close for a photo. The ground beneath him sighed. "Too soft," Elliot warned, but the sentence barely left his mouth before the slope gave a slow, decisive shrug. The world folded. Mud and roots and sky blurred into one rolling mass. Elliot grabbed Reed's jacket. The boy's shout lost in the roar, then weight, darkness, water, everything mixing, spinning. Gone. When stillness returned, it was the wrong kind. Elliot woke on his back, ribs aching, legs screaming. The radio blinked red and silent. He called out. Only wind answered. Reed was somewhere below, hidden by wreckage. Elliot tried to move, but the pain nailed him still. The trees above leaned at impossible angles. The smell of wet rock pressed close. Then came a sound low, deliberate, breaking through the rain's monotone, a growl, deep enough to tremble his teeth. Shapes moved in the half-light. Eyes glinted between stumps. 3, maybe 4, low to the ground, circling. Coyotes or wolves drawn by the crash. Elliot reached for a branch, his arm numb. The growls thickened, closing in. He braced for teeth and muscle. That's when a second voice cut through raw, rolling thunder, old as stone. The first coyote yelped and vanished. Through the rain, a larger form charged from the slope, sleek, scarred, furious. It hit the pack like a thrown log. One by one, the smaller shapes scattered, their hunger outmatched by something more ancient. Elliot stared, unable to name the blur, until it stood still and turned its head. The light caught golden eyes, steady, measuring him, a notch in the left ear, a faint hitch in the front leg. His breath left him. "Echo," he whispered. Voice scraped thin. The cat stood above him, sides heaving, rain carving lines down its fur. For a heartbeat, the storm quieted, as if even the mountain wanted to listen. Echo stepped closer, paw by paw, tail flicking. Blood marked the ground where it had fought. Dark streaks vanishing into mud. It sniffed the air, then touched its nose to Elliot's boot. A gesture both wild and domestic. The contact lasted one breath, long enough for recognition to bloom and ache. The pain in Elliot's leg surged. He slumped sideways, dizzy. Echo made a small chuffing sound, half command, half concern, and began pacing tight circles, as if herding invisible cattle. When he slipped towards sleep, he felt something rough against his hand. Fur, then warmth pressed into his palm. A promise shaped like a heartbeat. He drifted between waking and dream, hearing rain ease to a whisper. The cat settled beside him, body curved like a shield. The scent of pine, wet fur, and blood folded around the air. Elliot wanted to speak gratitude, but his throat failed. Echo stayed silent too, listening for what came next. The forest exhaled. The rain slowed to a mist, the kind that erases edges. Elliot blinked into a pale dawn, his body half buried in silk. The pain in his leg was steady now, a dull fire he could think around. Above him, the forest leaned inward, its silence broken only by a soft rumble, a sound close enough to breathing to make him listen harder. Echo stood watch at the edge of the landslide, fur dark with mud, flank heaving. Every muscle in the cat's frame flickered between instinct and decision. She scanned the ridge, nostrils wide, scenting for threat. Then, as if measuring a path only she could see, she stepped back toward Elliot, tail low, cautious but unafraid. Elliot tried to lift himself, failed. The movement drew a short, warning hiss. Echo pressed closer instead, nosing his jacket until her body blocked the wind. He could feel the heat of her through the soaked canvas. "Easy," he whispered. The word cracked, but the tone carried soft, steady, the same rhythm that once untangled fear from a trap. A thin whistle split the air, the mountain shifting again. Pebbles slid, roots tore. Echo's ears twitched toward the sound, head snapping up. She moved to the slope's edge, studying the way gravity tugged at loose dirt. When another crack echoed, she leapt down, vanishing into mist. Elliot's heart lurched at the sudden absence. Minutes, maybe hours, bled together. Then came movement again, branches shaking, an animal's grunt, the scrape of something heavy dragging across stone. Echo reappeared, pulling at a torn strip of Elliot's pack. Her teeth clenched in the strap. She dropped it near his hand, eyes locking with his, as if to remind him, survive first, speak later. Inside the pack were flares, a small medkit, a half-empty canteen. Elliot's fingers fumbled for the whistle, lips too numb to shape sound. Echo crouched beside him, muscles tensed, watching the sky brighten through the mist. When he struck the flare, the red blooms startled her. She didn't run. She stood between him and the slope, sentinel against the world. The fire's hiss blended with the wind. For a moment, she seemed caught between fleeing and staying. Ancient war waged inside her ribs. Then the choice anchored itself. Echo settled near his shoulder, tail curling forward until it touched his arm. The contact was deliberate, grounding. Elliot closed his eyes to that wild pulse. Time shrank. The flare guttered out. Above the ridge, the sound of rotor blades flickered through fog-thin, tentative, like a bird unsure of landing. Elliot forced his voice up through his throat. "Here," he shouted, or thought he did. Echo rose with him, ears swiveling toward the sky, eyes burning against the grey. A gust blew down the valley, cutting the mist. The helicopter's light strobed across the slope, painting red into the trees. Echo flattened against the ground, not from fear, but calculation. The roar grew near. Elliot raised the flare again. The ember touched her fur, painting it bronze for a heartbeat. She looked at him once, long enough to memorize his face again. When the rescue team rappelled down, she was gone. Only her tracks ringed his body, a circle pressed into mud and pine needles. Ranger Holt found him half-conscious, whispering the name like a prayer. They scanned the ravine for any sign of a big cat, but the forest had already closed its hand. Later, in the hospital, Reed would describe hearing a growl through the storm before they spotted the flare. Sounded close, he told the reporters, like something guarding him. Mara just nodded when she visited, setting her hand over Elliot's. "Some debts," she said, "don't ask to be repaid." That night, under sterile lights and antiseptic air, Elliot dreamed of the ridge again, the silence, the mist, and a bobcat walking the edge of broken earth. In the dream, she paused once, turned her head, and the forest bowed around her. He woke to the steady beep of the monitor, the rhythm not unlike a heartbeat shared. Winter pressed itself against the hospital windows, the glass fogging with the quiet labour of machines. Elliot's leg was pinned and wrapped, his breath running shallow through the hiss of oxygen. Beyond the sterile white, he saw pines swaying in slow rhythm, and for a flicker of a second imagined a shadow moving between them. Reporters came and went, chasing the miracle. Man survives landslide rescued by chance. They never wrote the other truth. Reed sat by the bed, eyes avoiding the bandages. It wasn't luck, he said softly. Something scared those coyotes off. Elliot smiled, small and unreadable, and said, "Some things don't need proof." When Mara arrived, she carried no flowers, only the smell of pine resin still caught in her coat. She read the charts, frowned at his pulse, and then asked quietly, "Did you see her again?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His eyes had that far-off shimmer, the kind people wear when the wild leaves its mark on them. Weeks passed, and he healed the way mountains do, slow, scarred, honest. Reporters lost interest. Reed returned to patrol. Yet nights at the rehab center stretched long, filled with the rhythm of distant wind. Once, in the thin dark before dawn, he heard a sound through the window low, even like fur brushing against bark. By early spring, Elliot moved back to his cabin. Mara helped stock wood, her steps crunching through the leftover snow. The forest had reclaimed the scar of the slide green moss, already knitting over the wound. At the porch, she paused. "You're cool if you see her?" she asked. "If she wants me to," he said, smiling. But she never did like an audience. The first night home, sleep came in fits. Every creak in the walls felt like memory returning. Near midnight, he opened the door. The air smelled of thawed earth and wet pine. A pale moon washed the clearing. Then, beyond the fence line, two golden sparks blinked once steady, calm, unafraid. He whispered the name without meaning to. Echo. The bobcat stood still, broader now. The notch in her ear, silvered by moonlight. The wind lifted her fur in ripples, rain slick and wild. She didn't move closer. She didn't flee. Elliot felt the space between them hum with something older than gratitude. "You found me again," he said, voice barely a breath. She lowered her head as if in answer. For long minutes, neither moved. Then Echo turned toward the dark ridge. Glancing back once, the message was clear as a heartbeat live. She vanished into the trees without sound, the forest closing behind her like water over a stone. He stood in the doorway, hand pressed to his chest, feeling the ache of something more than pain. At dawn, Ranger Holt visited with a clipboard, routine questions about the accident. Elliot told him little. When Holt left, he paused at the gate. "We found prints out there this morning," he said. "Big ones. Cat maybe. You've got a friend watching." Elliot only nodded, letting the man's words hang like fog that didn't need clearing. Reed came later with coffee and guilt he couldn't name. "She saved you," he said finally. Elliot shrugged. "Or maybe I was just where I was supposed to be. Reed laughed once, uneasy. But when he left, he lingered on the porch longer than usual, staring into the tree line. Sometimes belief begins that way. Evening fell soft, the forest pulsing with crickets and the slow stir of new leaves. Elliot sat by the fire, the old jacket folded on his lap, the same one that once carried a frightened cub out of a trap. He traced the claw marks in the sleeve with a fingertip, small scars stitched into fabric and memory alike. When the flames sank low, the wind shifted through the chimney, and in that hollow note, he heard it again, a low, familiar chuff, somewhere between greeting and goodbye. He leaned back, eyes closed, letting it pass through him. Outside, the bobcat's prints glowed faintly in the frost, a language written for anyone who still believes the wild remembers kindness. Spring settled like a slow breath over the ridge. The air carried thawed pine and the hum of water unfreezing its own name. Elliot moved through the clearing with a cane, slower but steady, his shadow joined now by birds and light instead of silence. The mountain had softened. Even the wind seemed to know he'd come home for good. Each morning he left the porch door open, not as an invitation, just respect. Sometimes he'd find the prints again, fresh, deliberate, crossing at an angle as if tracing old boundaries. He never followed them. Echo's world no longer needed maps, and his belonged exactly where he stood, at the seam between memory and mercy. Mara visited once a week, bringing dried herbs and stories from town. She laughed that the cat had made him a local myth. The man who talks to ghosts, she teased. Elliot smiled, poured her tea, and said, "She's no ghost. Ghosts don't leave paw prints." The look between them lingered longer than the joke. At dusk he walked the fence line, jacket zipped high, breath ghosting in the last light. Somewhere down the hollow, a low growl rolled not threat, but declaration. He stopped, hand against his chest, pulse syncing with the sound. The ridge answered with a soft echo, a duet across distance that felt like belonging. One evening, Reed came up the trail, his truck stuck half a mile back. "Cougar sighting near the river," he said, flashing a photo from a motion cam. But Elliot's eyes fixed on a smaller shape in the background, a bobcat, broad-shouldered, poised mid-step, watching the lens. Reed caught the look and grinned. "Your friend's famous now." A storm rolled in that night, sudden and electric. Rain lashed the tin roof and thunder flattened the ridge. Elliot stayed by the window, lamp unlit, eyes tracing lightning through the trees. At one flash, he saw her silhouetted on the far slope, soaked and unmoving. For a heartbeat, their worlds overlapped, silver and breathless. He wanted to open the door, to call her name, but the moment would not bear sound. The next flash found the slope empty again, rain sweeping the evidence clean. He sat down slowly, heart thudding, the room pulsing with absence that felt almost holy. The storm passed, leaving only the smell of wet bark and something like peace. Days after, Ranger Holt stopped by with paperwork for his land donation. Elliot had promised part of the valley to the Wildlife Trust. "Place ought to belong to what remembers it," he said, signing the line. Holt glanced around the cabin, noticing claw marks on the doorframe. He smiled, but didn't ask. Some stories live better unspoken. That night, Elliot dreamed in fragments, snow melting off a paw, sunlight cutting through mist, the weight of fur against his palm. When he woke, dawn was pink on the hills. The jacket by the chair was torn again, 3 new rips along the sleeve, clean and deep. He laughed softly, not surprised, and whispered, still guarding. By late spring, wildflowers knotted the slope like scattered embers. Mara joined him on the porch, the quiet between them full of knowing. Do you think she'll ever stay? She asked. He looked toward the tree line, where wind-bent grass in a rhythm only one creature walked. She already does, he said, just not the way we do. The sun fell slow, the ridge breathing light back into the world. Elliot leaned back, eyes closing as a faint chuff carried through the trees. The same low sound that once meant trust, then farewell, now both. He let it wash over him, neither cooling nor chasing. Beyond the fence, gold eyes flickered once, then vanished into green. Night came gentle. The porch lights stayed off. The forest folded around the cabin like a kept promise. Somewhere under the stars, a bobcat moved through fern and fog, her paws silent, her path sure. The man she'd saved slept soundly inside, the wild still watching over him, 2 lives balanced forever on the same heartbeat. The year turned quietly. Leaves dropped their gold and drifted into soil. Elliot felt the mountain's breath slow with winter's hand. His own heart echoed that rhythm, sometimes skipping, sometimes steady, always listening. He moved less now, but each step outside was deliberate, a small ceremony of gratitude for mornings still granted. The cabin had grown gentler with age. Wood creaked like a friend clearing its throat. On the mantel sat the old compass, his wedding photo, and the jacket creased, frayed, heavy with stories. He often caught himself talking to it, not as an old man losing sense, but as someone who finally understood what silence means when it stays. One late afternoon, Mara climbed the trail, breath misting in the cool air. She found him on the porch, tea cooling beside his hand. "You're giving the land next week?" she asked. Elliot nodded. It's time. Papers lay folded on the table, his final act of stewardship. "If the wild trusted me once," he said, "I owe it a home." They walked to the edge of the clearing. Frost sparkled like tiny stars across the grass. In the distance, a single call, low, feline, ancient, slid through the trees. Mara froze. "Was that?" she began. Elliot smiled faintly. "She checks in," he said. "Just making sure I haven't forgotten who owns this place." The sound faded, but left warmth behind. That night, wind scraped softly along the roof, whispering like pages turning. Elliot sat by the stove, tracing the seam of his cane with a thumb. The firelight made the shadows breathe. For a moment, the room seemed to hold 2 heartbeats, his and something quieter, deeper. He looked toward the door, half expecting eyes to glow there. He dreamed again of the ridge. Echoes stood by the old landslide, unscarred, watching him. She stepped closer, leaving prints that filled with light instead of snow. "It's all right," he heard her say, though her mouth never moved. You kept your promise. When he woke, dawn had already painted the window pale gold. The next day, Reed arrived with the ranger truck to help him file the transfer papers. He was quieter now, less certain, more reverent. You ever see her again? He asked as they packed up the last of the tools. Elliot didn't answer, but when Reed turned away, he caught the older man smiling at something only he could see. By sunset, the papers were signed. The Blue Ridge Wildlife Reserve now extended to include his valley. Your name's on the trail marker, Reed said. Elliot's crossing. Elliot laughed. That's the first time they've put my name somewhere. I didn't trip over it. But later, when alone, the joke left a lump in his throat. Snow came early. The world turned quiet under its weight. Elliot's breath misted softer each morning. Mara visited once more, carrying soup and the kind of worry that doesn't speak. He told her not to come again until spring. There are things the forest needs to say in private, he said. She understood. That night, a storm rose, soft at first, then fierce enough to rattle the shutters. Elliot sat by the window, too weak to move, but too calm to care. Out beyond the fence, something moved, a shape he knew by heart. Echo. She walked the line of snow and stopped at the porch steps. Their eyes met, distance closing. He opened the door, cold spilling in. Echo didn't enter. She sat in the snow, head bowed slightly, breath clouding between them. You can rest now, he whispered. The cat blinked once, slow and deliberate, then turned toward the woods. Her tail brushed the snow, erasing their shared path in a single, graceful line. Morning found the door still open. Mara arrived to silence, snow undisturbed except for a ring of paw prints circling the porch. Inside, Elliot lay peaceful, eyes closed, a faint smile at the edge of his mouth. She followed the tracks to the tree line, where they ended suddenly. No body, no trail, only the soft echo of wind that sounded almost like purring. The morning broke like a held breath, pale light spilling through the pines. Snow still clung to the branches, untouched except for a circle of paw prints fading near the porch. Mara stood there for a long time, gloved hands trembling around a mug she never drank from. The air was too still for grief. It felt more like reverence. Inside, the fire had died, but warmth lingered in the room, faint and stubborn. Elliot lay in his chair, head tilted slightly, as if he'd only fallen asleep, waiting for dawn. The open door let in the faint murmur of the forest. Mara touched his shoulder. He's gone, she whispered, though the words felt too small for what had left. Ranger Holt and Reed arrived hours later, boots creaking against frozen earth. Reed took off his hat when he saw him. Peaceful, he said, voice catching. Holt knelt by the doorway, tracing the tracks outside. Bobcat, he murmured. Came right up to the porch. Reed frowned. In this cold? Why? No one answered. Some questions weren't built for logic. They buried him beneath the oak he'd planted 30 years before the same one that shaded his first rescue cage. The ground was hard, but not unkind. Mara placed his jacket across the wooden box before the dirt covered it. She whispered, He carried life here. Let the earth carry him now. The wind sighed through the trees, as if in agreement. At dusk, the valley filled with golden mist. A figure moved at the tree line, low and deliberate. Fur brushed silver by fading light. Echo stepped from shadow into the clearing. Muscles rippling beneath her coat, she paused near the fresh mound of earth, nose lifting to the scent that had guided her back. The forest held its breath. The bobcat sat beside the grave, tail curled neatly, eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not pace or call. She simply stayed guarding, remembering. When the first stars blinked alive, she lowered her head, pressing her forehead to the soil once gently. Snow began to fall again, covering both print and promise. In town, they spoke of it for years. The ranger who swore he saw the cat that night, the vet who never doubted. Visitors came to the new sign at the trail's start. Elliot Ward and Echo. Proof that kindness leaves a trail. No one could find the bobcat again, though some claimed to hear her call when fog draped the ridge. Mara returned every spring, leaving a sprig of mountain laurel by the stone. Reed sometimes joined her, quieter than before. "You think she knows he's gone?" he asked once. Mara smiled. "No, I think she knows he's still here." The wind carried her words up the slope, where sunlight met the cool hush of the trees. Years passed, and the valley healed into legend. The cabin sank a little deeper into moss, its windows fogged with memory. Children of hikers pressed their faces to the glass, swearing they saw a shape move inside a man in a green jacket and a cat resting by the fire. Their parents only laughed, but lowered their voices afterward. On certain mornings, when the fog rolled thin and the world seemed half asleep, the oak tree shimmered with dew. 2 sets of prints, one booted, one pawed, circled the trunk before vanishing toward the creek. No one ever managed to follow them. The forest kept what it loved close, and what it owed closer still. As time folded the story into myth, the ridge remained unchanged. Pines whispered his name, the way rivers hold echoes, never ending, only softened. And somewhere deep in the hollow, where no road reaches, a bobcat moved through the ferns, her gait sure, her heart calm. Each step was a memory kept, each breath a quiet thank you. When the last light of evening slipped behind the mountains, a faint chuff carried through the valley, a sound of recognition, not farewell. The forest answered with wind, and the world exhaled in unison. Elliot and Echo, 2 souls stitched together by mercy, now lived where no distance could divide them, within the silence that remembers kindness. If this story touched your heart, just drop a 1 in the comments, or a 0 if it stayed quiet inside you. Don't forget to subscribe. There are more gentle stories waiting just beyond the trees.